Okay, so Danielle, thank you very much for talking to me and the people at the University of Waterloo. Our discussion is going to be extremely valuable to them. We're going to talk about technology and privacy, which you've done a lot of work on. But I want to start just by saying that there appears to be increasing awareness that privacy can be significantly negatively impacted by the time we're spending online. And I thought it would be useful if you could just provide an introduction to our discussion by highlighting the main ways that technology affects privacy today.
Thank you very much, Peter. And it's a tremendous privilege for me to be able to speak to you and to the community at Waterloo. What I'd like to do is I'd like to back up a little bit and draw a distinction between two concepts I think that generate a lot of confusion. One is privacy and the other is personal information. And I think that for this conversation, as it progresses, it's important to draw this distinction. So privacy is a concept that's really that is linked to the individual and in some senses to a concept of an individual and their human rights. It's rather an amorphous concept. It's not defined very well in any legislation, actually, even though we recognize rights to privacy. The Supreme Court provides the following definition. Privacy is a biographical core of personal information which individuals in a free and democratic society would wish to maintain and control from dissemination to the state and other individuals. By extension, I've added that last piece. And in contrast, or as a subset, I would say, of privacy, we have personal information, which is defined by various laws as information about an identifiable individual. Now, that can be broad, right? So it can be my IP address, it can be the color of my eyes, it can be my blood type, it can be the marmalade I like to eat. It can be vast. And where I think we have a little bit of confusion right now is that it's much easier, and I think it's been more effective, regardless of where we are around the world, to legislate personal information. It's tangible. We know more or less what information and data consist of. So we've legislated that, but we've legislated it, or we've regulated it rather, in a way as if it were almost equivalent to privacy. And so there's this confusion. We protect pretty much all personal information as if it were a part of our biographical core, where it isn't. I mean, my marmalade is not sensitive. I may change my taste in marmalade tomorrow. I'm not sure that my consumer pattern in marmalade consumption are really as private to me as, say, my blood type or any, genetic illness I may be in the process of inheriting. So there's a bit of confusion there. Now, does technology affect both? Yes, I think that technology, as we know, can be incredibly invasive of our personal space as it pertains to a right to privacy. But I think there's a tremendous collection also of personal information of which we are perhaps less aware. And I think this is where the bulk of our focus is. Before I finish on this question, I just want to say that when we talk about regulating personal information, irrespective of where we are in the world, there are 8 principles that apply and that usually, I guess, characterize any personal information protection legislation. These principles were originally developed by the OECD, and they are as follows. Any entity that collects personal information is required to limit the collection to what is absolutely necessary to fulfill the ends for which they need that information. They need to ensure that there's a quality to the data so that the data is reliable, up to date. We need to specify the purpose for which we're collecting. We need to limit, again, the use for which we're collecting the information to what is absolutely necessary. We need to provide appropriate security safeguards for this information so that it's protected based on the sensitivity of that information from the various threat actors that are out there. We also need to be open about our information practices. What are we doing with your information? What are we, who are we sharing it with? Who has access to this information? We want to enable individuals, to the extent possible, to have some participation and say over how their information is processed. So we want to enable them to have access to their information, to be able to correct any information that they think is inaccurate. Sometimes, depending on the jurisdiction, they have the right to have that information removed, deleted, internet links to that to personal information severed. And finally, accountability. If I collect your personal information as an organization, the buck stops here. If there's a problem, because I didn't protect it properly, I need to compensate you. I need to inform you of that breach. So those are the principles.
That's it, and that's a very helpful introduction to what we're going to be talking about here. But it almost also seems to suggest that there is this distinction in the different types of information suggests that those two types should be dealt with differently in terms of the rights and regulations that there are that surround them, which I'm sure we'll come to as we proceed through our topics. My next question, I guess, follows from what you've said, and it's around the extent that you think we should accept that there will be a loss of privacy in exchange for the value we get from the internet. So we often hear, sure, you're going to lose a bit of privacy, but that's okay, or that's what we need to trade in order to get the benefit we get from the internet. So how do you feel about that?
Well, I don't necessarily believe that in terms of privacy, we need to compromise more than we would ordinarily. I think we have to be careful, obviously, about how we interact with this technology. Where I do think that there is perhaps a little more give and take and maybe a little more compromise is actually with respect to personal information. So there is a capacity on the part of whatever technology to collect vast amounts of information. And frequently, we're not always aware of what's being collected, how quickly it's being collected, and how it's being used. So I think that that's really the area where we are foregoing some of our control.
Yeah, and then again, another important nuance. You have your nuance on the first question around types of data. And on this question, you're basically saying, well, for some of what we do in life, we do have to compromise on our privacy a little bit, but it's different with the internet, or there are aspects of our use of the internet that are going further, perhaps, and are different from what we've done before. But important to understand, we always have shared there's always been some compromise on some aspects of our life.
I read a book a couple of years ago by a woman named Dana Boyd, a very interesting book called It's Complicated. And what she was doing in this book was she was analyzing the way that teenagers interact with social media. And I heard her speak, and she was addressing this myth that teenagers don't care about privacy. The young people don't care about privacy anymore. They do anything. And what she did, in fact, and I thought this was extremely interesting, was that she debunked that by saying, no, that's not true. It's not that they don't care about privacy. They found another way to protect it. One of the ways is to create false profiles. So, a 14-year-old girl living in Quebec would present themselves or enroll in whatever it was as a 36-year-old woman from Ontario, businesswoman. And so profiles were inaccurate. And I think that that's caused, at least friends of mine who work in the marketing industry have noticed when they engage in sort of this targeted marketing, that sometimes that isn't working as well as one would anticipate because of this falsification or disinformation that's happening when one checks in and creates a profile. So I think that what it's doing is it's creating perhaps a more attuned, more sophisticated use of this technology and protection of privacy.
Okay, so people are doing things that are intended to defend themselves in these conditions. And Okay, well, that seems reasonable that they would do that. Okay, so the use of artificial intelligence is growing today. So I thought it'd be important that I ask you what challenges you think it poses to privacy.
Well, I think there are a number of them. And just coming back to the previous example about being able to falsify one's profile, that's great if you control the information. It is not great if you don't know what's being generated about you behind your back, as it were, because you don't know where your information has got to. So there's a limited success to being able to design your profile the way you want. Coming back to artificial intelligence, and privacy, well, I think there's been a bit of a dust up recently over this ChatGPT algorithm, and I think the greatest, well, one of the features that people are unhappy about is the fact that it overcollects information. So there isn't a collection limitation going on there. I've also read that it's not clear when it can be turned on, when it can be turned off in certain instances, not all the time, but there've been problems around that. And then, and this is, I think, to me, it's a very important data collection principle that we've overlooked systematically up until now, is the data quality principle, and the fact that when one is training one's machinery and when one is basing results on information that is inaccurate, you can't help but generate an inaccurate result. Now, that's not the algorithm's fault. It's not the algorithm. It's the fact that we're feeding in inaccurate information and then coming out with an inaccurate result. That's where I think things become messy and dangerous, actually.
Absolutely. And considering that danger, many countries and regions like the European community have implemented or are considering implementing regulation that are addressing technology-based privacy concerns. What are the trends that you see in regulation today?
Well, I think the regulation, there are very much a reflection of the countries from which the regulations are coming. I mean, data to me is just a new geopolitical checkerboard where you have different political entities, or even countries, but alignments. And so you see emerging from Europe, very human-centered, very respectful, or at least there's an attention to trying to protect the individual with the development of artificial intelligence. In the United States, I mean, I'm glossing over this and, generalizing, but there's a little more of a wait and see approach to, well, let's see where this goes. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't regulations. There are, but it's sort of, okay, we'll regulate the more egregious abuses. And then we have China, which is a real force in this area that, and again, at the risk of grossly oversimplifying, seems to be developing and regulating the development of this area very much to the benefit of the state and the government, the Chinese government. So you have these trends, and we're trying to find, some way to cross borders and to communicate across borders with all of these different political landscapes.
Yeah, and I mean, certainly an area that is continuing to evolve very quickly. We're seeing a lot of new regulation and new policy discussions taking place around this, both in Europe and the US, and to a degree in China still too. It will be very interesting to watch, but your summary seems to, very well encapsulate the position at the moment.
It's tremendously interesting to watch. I think one of the statistics that I've seen is that over 50% of investment in AI right now is, in fact, in China, much less in Europe, and then obviously in the United States. But another interesting statistic I heard yesterday was that 2/3 of people scientists working in this area in the United States come from elsewhere. So they've been trained elsewhere, but they're coming to the United States because clearly that is, where you can go to learn and to develop and to have the freedom to sort of invent and play with this technology and to see where it's going to go.
Yeah, and it's an active area at Waterloo at the moment too.
Yeah, I know.
This whole question of the impact of that knowledge and who we should work with in other parts of the world and things like that. And rightly, there is a discussion around that and about what the right thing to do is.
Well, and the other thing is I guess that the gap is narrowing, but there seems to be a disconnect between a very sort of science fiction view of what AI is and a very concrete view of where AI is now. And, a regulator or a legislator trying to figure out which foot to dance on and not necessarily understanding the technology, and the technology also saying, well, wait a second, we're not doing that yet. So, it's very interesting.
Absolutely. And we should also talk about regulation in Canada, because of course we're having discussions around that here at the moment. So can you talk about our own regulation?
Yeah, our own regulation, well, our own regulation is not as developed, let's say, as Europe's is. There is a bill on the table, part of C27, which is a bill to overhaul Canada's Personal Information and Electronic Document Protection, Personal Information Protection Electronic Document Act, which dates from 2000 and which does need an overhaul. And so part of this overhaul was the introduction of an artificial intelligence bill, which is the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. Now, for people like me, it was quite disappointing because it doesn't really delve into artificial intelligence and to the various use cases and address the challenges that different use cases and different scenarios can pose. Basically, what this law says is, look, be careful if you're doing anything that's a high risk development of artificial intelligence. And oh, by the way, be sure that your data is as clean as you can. So they're asking, obviously, for forms of privacy impact analysis, where one reviews the data and ensures that there are no biases, or there are as few biases as possible that are produced by this information, which is good. I mean, that's fantastic, but it doesn't go far enough. And it certainly doesn't go as far as the proposed bill in Europe does, where it basically looks at various categories of artificial intelligence and says, look, artificial intelligence that's used to manipulate people, out and out manipulate people, that is not to be developed. Artificial intelligence that's really low risk, so low level chatbots that don't do things that ChatGPT does, those are fine. But there's a middle level of artificial intelligence, for example, any form of algorithm that's being used for human resource purposes, hiring, where an individual can be affected by a decision that's being taken by a machine. Well, in those instances, we need to analyze it a bit more. You have to run the appropriate, the appropriate screening. And so, it's a much more sophisticated, much more fulsome legislation than what we're proposing.
And the regulation we've seen so far, a lot of that in Europe, or more advanced in Europe, perhaps. What has been successful, and where has it struggled, and what do you think we've learned about what we should do in the future there?
Well, I think it's really interesting because I think it's challenged us on many fronts. I mean, just a very basic one. Look, Italy was able to use the GDPR, if I'm not mistaken, to halt ChatGPT because of overcollection and because of inaccuracy of data. That's, I think, a basic example. But on a broader sort of spectrum, we thought that internet, all of this stuff was uncontrollable, but that's not true. I mean, you look at the way that China, for instance, has been able to control things like TikTok, where you have a Chinese TikTok and you have a TikTok that's available for the rest of the world. And the Chinese TikTok, as I understand, because I do not speak Mandarin, is a very, very circumscribed, very focused use, and that promotes, I guess, a higher level of content, obviously propaganda, but also a higher level of content than a TikTok that is available to my kids, for example. So it's not true that these things that cannot be regulated. The other thing that's been remarkable is the tremendous impact that something like the European regulation, the GDPR, has had, because before it was unheard of. Oh, you can't regulate extraterritoriality. Extraterritorially, and Europe has just said, no, that's not true. You know what? You do business on Europeans in Europe, you listen to our laws, and we will fine you. Now, for a large organization, perhaps the fines are not significant, but it has made a lot of other jurisdictions sit up, watch, and begin to think about the way they process data and legislate consequently.
Absolutely. So there's been some discussion about who should own data, with some people suggesting that we should have ownership of our own data. What do you think about that? What powers should we have? And maybe this goes back to your thoughts about the two different types of data.
Well, I'm a firm believer that the individual should be given control over their data. There are means to do this. Now, they're not perfect, but when one thinks about decentralized ledgers, that kind of technology ledgers, also that kind of technology can be used to create individual data wallets, where if I want a service, then I'll pay using my data, or I'll exchange my data for that service. And I think that that's a model that's very interesting. It needs to be perfected. But the advantage of that is that your data rests with you. And so these kinds of crazy cyber attacks, the cyber criminals that, target a big central of many people's data, that in some sense disarms them. But it also, I think, forces individuals to realize what currency data is, and to assume responsibility for their own data. So I find that a very interesting model. Obviously, it's not perfected, but I think it could be a really interesting course to follow.
Well, almost seems to suggest that if we were, for example, going to a retail store to buy something, today when we do that, if we're doing it online, they get access to lots of our data. And, we get various messages around products we might want and things like that. This seems to suggest we would pick the information that could be shared and what they could do with that data.
Well, and it works within, a certain context. So very much the consumer context. I think it works very well there. Now, where it falls apart is with information that as a society we need in order to move forward. So census data, data concerning health. If we want to have a public health system, there has to, I think, be some give and take in that area where, a centralized entity that is providing health services should also be allowed to benefit from the information of the individuals that they help care for. So, and so what is the model? I don't know. But I do think it is interesting in that it's really breaking down already physically the idea of what is personal space, what is public space, is really challenged by this information. And I think that this, with respect to data governance, that's another area. What is public sector? What is private sector? Can we even speak of those two? And should we not come up with different models where private, public, and the individual, everybody works together to try and figure out how to manage this?
Yeah, I had a student a number of years ago now who was looking at this for the federal government in Canada, and basically for healthcare, what should our policy be around which data should be shared, which data should be public, what should the relationships be with the private health companies like pharmaceutical companies and others who may do things that were in the public interest with the data, but at the same time, would be potentially be able to use the data for purposes that weren't in the public interest. And, you know, there were all these questions about where the boundaries should be. And her job, I thought, was fascinating. And I don't think we've got all the answers to it yet. But I was encouraged that we were looking at it. That was good.
Well, it's interesting too, because then if you get back to my favorite data principle, the data integrity or data quality principle, if you leave everything up to the individual, you, I think by definition, leave it, create skewed results, because perhaps certain people, certain groups, certain whatever, decide that they want to share, but other groups are more reluctant. Now it could be it could be geopolitical, it could be sociological, it could be cultural. And so you're not getting a completely unbiased data set. And so it's difficult.
It's a fascinating area because there are so many strong arguments, you would think, around healthcare data, of the things that could be done with it in the public interest, that could do wonderful things for health research. But at the same time, that may raise some objection or discomfort, concern amongst some people that even though their data is being used for public good, they still don't want it to be shared.
Well, it's going to be very interesting to follow the European Data Governance Act, which comes into effect as of September this year. And I think it provides for greater sharing possibility for the health sector, the environment, agriculture, data mobility, and these are all obviously intertwined, and they're also, and I think this is going to be very, very interesting to see going forward how this all evolves and whether there are lessons to draw from it.
Yeah, it seems to be another of these areas where we have uncertainty about what the right answers are. I mean, we're aligned, I think, mostly to some degree on the benefit the desirability of the benefit that would come from it, but exactly where the decisions should be made around it is still evolving and very interesting to be part of. Okay, next question. 2 left. Many people watching this will be working with information-based technology. A lot of people at Waterloo do that. What would you say to them about their ethical and legal obligations in working with data?
What would I say?
Hard question.
Well, I did enumerate the 8 data principles. So until further notice, those are the ones that apply. I would also, I guess I would advise try and make sure that the data is, again, as clean as it possibly can be. And that's no mean feat. I remember a couple of years ago, I was involved in a program at another university, and the students, it was an internship, the students had a project to do using data. And I think they took out of a 10-week program, 8 weeks just cleaning up the data before they could even get started. So that's one thing. Make sure that the data is clean. And I would also say, if you can't get consent, at least try and be transparent and accountable for the data that you're using. I think that just goes, that's just basic human decency. If you're, borrowing something that belongs to somebody else, try and be as transparent, and also know what you're doing, because a lot of these projects sound really good until you actually dig a little deeper and say, okay, well, what are we actually doing? And again, I think we've spoken about this earlier. This isn't a technology area. This is a philosophy area. This is an ethics area. And I think that's an area that perhaps we haven't seen as much attention focused on in high school. Philosophy is really important. Ethics is really important. Basic humanities are really important. And we cannot develop technology intelligently. These are not separate fields of study. They must go hand in hand if we're to advance, I think, as a civilization.
Yeah, one of the things I say frequently to engineers is that in the past, they had access or there existed regulations and guidelines, and there was some higher level of clarity around the ethical implications of decisions they might make as engineers in their jobs. But now with technology changing so quickly and the range of capabilities and possibilities that come from that expanding so quickly, as engineers in their jobs, they're going to be making decisions that have ethical implications that they will not have guidance anywhere on what that decision should be. And it's going to be their own moral standards and their own awareness of ethical implications of what they might do that is going to be important. They're going to need to make appropriate decisions, aware that they can be impacting other people. And with privacy and data, that also seems to be true.
Well, and you think also of the use that can be made of deep fakes. That right now at this point in time is terrifying. Of course, as a society, we'll figure it out. We will figure it out. We always do. It's just that things are happening very quickly, and there's a tremendous amount of collateral damage that could happen.
Absolutely. Okay, last question. It's kind of a catch-all question, but we've talked a lot about data and privacy. And so I thought we should give the people watching some advice on their own personal behavior as internet users. And so that really is what I'm asking as my final question. What would you tell people to do as they navigate the internet these days?
Okay, at the risk of sounding pithy and moralizing, I would say that data is the new currency, and be careful how you spend it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So thank you for answering my questions, Danielle. I really appreciate it. I think what you've had to say will be very helpful to the people who watch it. They, as they move into the world as scientists and engineers, they're going to be involved in decisions around many of the things that we've talked about, and this will hopefully help them make the world a better place.
It's so exciting to be involved in this. I mean, Waterloo's really been a beacon for years and years. So it's a real privilege, and thank you very much for inviting me.